Coming up next, Mandy Turnbull. Coming up next, Robot Girl. Coming up next, Ben. Coming up next, Robot Girl. Coming up next, Star vs. the Forces of Evil. Coming up next, the 7D. Coming up next, Greg. Coming up next, Gregory. Coming up next, Flapjack vs. the Forces of Evil. Coming up next, the 7E. Coming up next, Chad. Coming up next, Chaz. Coming up next, Chowder vs. the Forces of Evil. Coming up next, the 7F. Coming up next, Dude, That's My Ghost. Coming up next, Matt's Monsters. Coming up next, Pink Panther and Pals. Coming up next, Pink Panther and Sons. Coming up next, Harvey. Coming up next, Hamster. Coming up next, Wacky Races. Coming up next, Raccoon. Coming up next, Snap. Coming up next, Happy. Coming up next, Fish Hooks. Coming up next, Hello Jadoo. Coming up next, Space Goofs. Coming up next, Chibi Maruko-chan. Coming up next, Fishtronaut. Coming up next, Garfield and Friends. Coming up next, Disco Bear. Coming up next, Dylan.